Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to another exciting episode. Joining me on the pod is Victoria Salinas, the former Chief Resilience Officer at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Victoria did some groundbreaking adaptation work at FEMA, and she comes on to share some of her work there and what it meant to embed climate adaptation into one of the most powerful disaster agencies in the world, and also what we stand to lose now at FEMA. Under the previous administration, FEMA was making real strides, funding community-led resilience, prioritizing equity, and preparing for disasters before they struck. That work is being dismantled. The current administration is slashing resilience programs, sidelining science, and unraveling years of hard-won institutional knowledge. It's a dangerous moment, one that could set adaptation efforts back a generation. Victoria walks us through what was working, what's now at risk, and why resilience must be apolitical if we ever hope to make it stick. It's an enlightening but also very sobering conversation with one of the leading adaptation voices in emergency management. You'll enjoy hearing about some of the victories they had at FEMA and why it needs to be a critical piece in our national adaptation response. Let's get into it. Hey, Adapters, joining me is Victoria Salinas. Victoria is a senior fellow at the Climate Resilience Institute of the University of Miami and on the board of directors for ICLE USA, Local Governments for Sustainability, and was a former head of resilience for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, during the Biden administration. Hi, Victoria. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation. We've had a few conversations in advance of this, but this is also going to be a tricky conversations because we're going to be talking about your previous position at FEMA, but then we're going to talk about what's happening now. And my listeners all know what sort of horror show is happening right now. So it's not my kind of typical conversation, but I guess just to give us started, can you tell us a little bit about your history up until you started working with FEMA? Then we'll go from there.
Sure. So I've been in this field of community resilience for a really long time. I got my start actually working internationally in communities that had been impacted by conflict and war. And then Katrina happened and it looked like a war zone and felt like so many different issues were happening here in the US that I got into disaster recovery. And when resilience really started taking off as an urban development issue, I had been at the World Bank and ended up applying for and becoming the first Chief Resilience Officer for Oakland, California. So I've really been in this space for a couple decades now.
Can you give us the details of when you came into the position at FEMA? How did they recruit you? How did you end up taking that position?
So I had volunteered for what they call policy committees that ramp up once a president has been selected. And I was volunteering on the resilience and climate policy committees. And after that process, volunteers are invited to submit their resumes and cover letters into a big black box and say all the places that they might be interested in working in government. And so that was what I did because I was really interested in serving as part of the Biden-Harris administration. The focus on equity, on climate was very aligned with my own values, and submitted my resume, my cover letter, and 6 months later, out of the blue, finally got a call to interview for the role at FEMA.
Serving in a presidential administration is a huge honor, but also FEMA is unique in that you guys had encountered it's not an easy agency to be part of. Was that part of any of your calculus when you took the position?
So I'd worked at FEMA once before following Hurricane Katrina as a presidential management fellow.
Okay.
And so I knew the challenges that FEMA encounters. I'd been involved in many community recovery efforts. And one of the things that I had learned after leaving FEMA, both through my work internationally, but then as a chief resilience officer, and then working with so many local governments, was I had a deep appreciation for the role that FEMA plays as a key agency in helping communities with their adaptation, risk reduction, resilience journey. And so I was really excited to come into the role with this portfolio that covers everything from tools to help communities understand risk to the National Flood Insurance Program, the post-disaster grants, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community grants, schoolhouses. And so it's a very robust portfolio that really has so many of those critical pillars for helping communities achieve their goals for resilience.
Again, it being such a unique agency, it in a lot of ways is very reactive. So when you came in, did you have a vision of what you wanted to do on the resilience side, or you just described some of the things that are already there, but were you able to think like that?
Yeah, so resilience was created during the Trump administration by bringing what people often think about as hazard mitigation programs together with preparedness programs. And so I walked into an organization that had so many of the critical capabilities that our nation and communities need, but they were very much siloed. So a big part of what I focused on was building a cohesive organizational culture, bringing together like capabilities, making sure that we were making it as easy as possible for communities of all capacity levels with all types of constraints to move forward with building and investing in their resilience. And so my part of FEMA was absolutely the part of FEMA, is the part of FEMA today that is about stopping that rinse and repeat cycle that we see with disaster response and recovery.
When you were there, this comes up a lot of my podcasts, is that there's the language of, okay, it's climate adaptation, it's climate resilience, and you find, especially in the federal government, resilience is a more preferred word. Was that an issue at all, or were you even not thinking like that?
Whenever you talk resilience, many people want to start with a definitional conversation because different disciplines really focus on different elements of resilience. But we've had a pretty standard definition of what resilience means in the federal government for a very long time, which essentially gets at the ability of people and systems and communities to both better prepare, withstand disruption, recover more quickly, and really adapt to adversity and change. And so the definition itself is holistic. And so all of those terms, whether it's hazard mitigation, risk reduction, preparedness, they all sit under the umbrella of resilience. And during the last administration, I think we made a lot of headway with the release of the National Resilience Guidance and other things to really make it more concrete how communities and households can pursue and strengthen their own resilience.
Okay, but so climate adaptation, it doesn't sound like it was really referenced at all. All those kind of things fit under just resilience.
Yeah, adaptation is an approach, is a necessary approach for achieving resilience. So it's part of how you get towards that goal.
That's interesting. I've had this conversation quite a bit, and I would flip that around, and a lot of my listeners would flip that around, is that resilience is just like one approach that you would fit under the umbrella of climate adaptation, this broader approach to climate. We don't have to agree. It's interesting. That's how you guys talked about it and had it in the context. Very interesting. All right. Tell us a little bit, because you were there at FEMA, and I imagine you look at your work week and you have meetings all week and you try to, as you say, plan ahead, but then in your unique position too, you never know what storm's going to come and what disaster that you're going to have to respond to. What was that like? Because you try to have a normal schedule, but then all of a sudden you're just dealing with the outcome of a hurricane.
FEMA is very much an agency that's mission is to help people before, during, and after. And so you're absolutely right. That focus on the before, the proactive, can be complicated and made hard when there's multiple disaster responses happening, right? And so a couple years ago, it was every 3 days that there was some kind of a disaster or emergency declaration that from a state. Last year was almost every other day. And so with Helene and Milton, for instance, I had so many of our own staff and teams in the field. And so it made steady state program implementation much more challenging when people are also deploying as part of the response. That said, being able to do both, respond to the emergencies and reduce the risk so we can stop that cycle, is core to effective disaster management. And so it was very much like our big focus was doing that, like doing everything, using all the tools, all the programs, partnerships to really be proactive. And then for those communities that had been impacted by disasters, ensuring that the recovery process itself doesn't rebuild vulnerabilities in place, but provided a pathway to more resilient recovery and a resilient future.
So if it's working really well, you work locally, let's say state governments or some of your partners. I grew up in Florida. And I remember, I think it was like 2005, there were like 4 or 5 hurricanes that came through. And I think Florida has a relatively good reputation, at least in regards to hurricanes and how they respond to these things. But those partners allow you to do a lot more.
They do, absolutely, particularly on the response side. And then on the resilience side of the house, the partners are also a wide array of partners too. A lot of the cities have big teams that focus on reducing risk and building resilience and adaptation and all of those different important focus areas.
I want to talk about some of the specific programs that were at FEMA, because I think it's good to contrast with what potentially are being cut. Tell me a little bit about the community disaster resilience zones. What purpose did they serve?
So the community disaster resilience zones was what came out of bipartisan legislation that directed FEMA to do a couple of things. First, it directed FEMA to use national data to understand where in our nation we have the greatest intersection of disaster risk and social and economic vulnerability. And why that matters is that we've got so many challenges in so many places, but really being able to prioritize those communities most impacted and most vulnerable helps us get to that goal of a resilient nation faster. And so that's really what Congress intended with that. And so FEMA went through a multi-year process. We went designating at the census tract level those places that the data highlighted as most at risk and most in need. And so we did that for all 50 states and then completed the designations in a more collaborative fashion with tribal nations and territories. And part of prioritizing and the value of prioritizing in a data-driven way, risk-informed way, is that it unlocks the power of collaboration. And so we had multiple federal agencies using community disaster resilience zone designations and their own grants and their own approach to providing technical assistance. We had private sector partners, including the Walmart Foundation, funding community navigators to help communities with these cedar zones. And for our own grants, like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant, it meant that projects that benefited those areas got a better cost share. So meaning the federal government would pay 90% versus 75% of projects serving those high-risk, underserved communities.
So you'd mentioned how data played an important part of this. And so this whole notion of future conditions data, now this actually shifted local planning a bit. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's, I think, shifted local planning in a number of ways. The focus on underserved and disadvantaged communities really pushed a lot of jurisdictions to understand that confluence of disaster risk and vulnerability in a much more targeted way, and therefore develop plans and projects that make a difference to those communities on the front line. And then FEMA also has had a very big focus on making future conditions data much more accessible. And so, for instance, the National Risk Index, which was used to establish community disaster resilience zones, had a whole project underway looking at integrating the future conditions into the National Risk Index. We'd partnered with Argonne National Lab and AT&T on the Climate Risk and Resilience portal that has multiple hazards at a downscaled neighborhood level so that planners, emergency managers can really understand future risk and make sure that they're taking actions today for the different scenarios that are highly likely in their own backyards.
Maybe you can give a couple examples here, but what specific communities or I guess even partnerships stood out as success stories for you? Like you're like, all right, things are really working well with these guys.
Yeah, so I'll name a couple. In my role, I had the opportunity to really visit all parts of the United States and meet with so many different types of communities. And a couple that stand out include in Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the neighborhood that's the most low-lying neighborhood is called Eastwick. And Eastwick, when you look at things from the environmental justice perspective, has had to deal with it all. It was a community that was redlined, and so you saw it's predominantly still African American today. Flood risk, because it was the most low-lying, it was near a landfill, it's near the airport, it has creek and riverine flooding, disinvestment, all of these different things. And so it's a community that really wanted to tackle its issues holistically. And when I had the opportunity to visit last year and walk the neighborhood with the community groups, including Eastwick United, one of the things that really, to me, that we can make systemic transformative change was that EPA had just, for instance, capped the landfill and planted all these trees and widened and cleaned the creek so that it would flood less. We were going to be putting in near-term flood barrier while Army Corps of Engineers did something longer term. There was collaboration between Philadelphia, the neighborhood in Philadelphia, and the county, Delaware County, across the water. And so all of these things were coming together in a way that the community leader I was speaking with was hopeful and grateful that things were actually changing, that she, older woman, was no longer going to have to run down to the creek and start the telephone tree about what was happening with the water, because all the pieces to a systemic solution, including like early warning monitors in the creek that were targeted to their neighborhood, were coming into place. And so I share that example because there is no panacea, but there is collaboration that has taken place. Philadelphia invested in people to work with this neighborhood. And so the community's aspirations for itself were being realized. And so I saw that happen in a number of places where, through hard work, collaboration, persistence, we were and are bending the curve because of that kind of persistence and dedication that we see in spades in communities across America.
Obviously, communication is really important to me. When I look at these success stories that you just shared, did the issue of climate change come up? Did you feel like that was part of that conversation, or was that too esoteric to bring into what you were trying to do there on the ground?
It absolutely comes up both head on and then as a secondary issue, depending on where in the country you are, right? So plenty of communities very much talk about their experience of more severe and extreme events as caused by climate change, right? And there's plenty of states and local jurisdictions that are using that future conditions data, recognizing that yesterday's patterns are not indicative of tomorrow's reality. And so even states like Idaho, they use that climate risk and resilience portal that I mentioned that AT&T and Argonne and FEMA had done to better understand their future risk. What was climate change and these global climate models going to do to Idaho? And one of the things that in talking with the state emergency management director, he highlighted that he'd probably thought about it, but it wasn't like he had an aha moment, was that they're going to have less snowpack. All the global climate models, no matter how many degrees you look, how bad it is, how good it gets, has them having less snowpack, which means more drought. And so it may be a decade from now that Idaho's dealing with more severe drought, but it's something that they can start doing as a state today to change local ordinances for water conservation, double plumbing, all of these different things that are part of drought mitigation, because they understand that the consequences of climate change mean that they have less snow, they have more drought, and they have a new reality coming, whether it's tomorrow or a couple decades down, so they can take action today.
Did you ever have to downplay climate change? Maybe there's some local elected officials or whatever. Is that something that you just had to do?
I think for FEMA in particular, one of the things that it's a consequence management agency. And so in some ways, in states where climate change can't be spoken about as climate change, I worked with plenty of state and local emergency managers who figured out how to not utter those words, yet absolutely do everything in their power to address the consequences of climate change. So it was less about let's have the debate about the why, but let's really look at the data and what we can know, because that's constantly improving. What can we know about what's likely tomorrow at the end of century, and be ready to deal with those consequences? So whether it was an explicit conversation about climate change in certain states or not, it was more about really having a risk-informed conversation, doing risk-informed planning, and making sure that all the projects being pursued are ones that are going to last for what is likely to occur because of the drivers of climate change.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I used to be in the federal government and I get it, but being on the outside, you just said not really talking about the why of it all. And then not having that conversation about the why, it sort of undercuts the severity of the risk if you're not really acknowledging if you're dealing with that why. So I know I'm just lecturing you, but you know what I'm saying? It's just, yeah.
No, I think it's ultimately to meet a community where they're at is really important in supporting them make progress with their goals. And so there's certainly a calculus around, do we have a debate about this why? Like when I was the chief resilience officer in Oakland, my position was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, right? They had started 100 resilient cities. There were certainly people in Oakland who I wanted to collaborate with who felt they couldn't work with me because my funding came from Rockefeller, which had made money in extractive industries, or the consulting company that was supposed to be helping us also did, even though we were working with their sea level rise people and climate adaptation people, they also did consulting for oil and gas. And so there's certainly one can go deep down any one of these pathways when it comes to differences of opinion. But I think my focus and the focus of the agency had been on problem solving. And so making sure that no matter where you fall on the spectrum, when it comes to these issues, that you're got the best available information, you're planning for the future, and that you're making sure that your people and your environment and systems are protected for the long haul.
Yeah, I get it. It's just the overall this kind of tiptoeing around certain audiences. And I think they can sniff out like, oh, are you being completely authentic with me? Even though they don't want to hear what you have to say. And I'm just projecting on you. I'm talking about a lot of federal agencies. And it's the missed chance for communication. But
we did a lot to educate. It wasn't like there was no conversation. I mentioned that part of resilience includes schoolhouses, the National Disaster Emergency Management University. And so there was a lot of education that was done around climate literacy to really not demonize people for not understanding or having a different belief set, but educating about the difference of everything from climate to weather and like all of these different core concepts, and even a new climate adaptation certificate for emergency managers to really bring people along and develop their skill sets, but in a non-politicized way, just really because the point of the matter is you need to understand the consequences in order to do something about it. And absolutely, the agency had doubled down on improving the education and capacity building to understand both the drivers of climate change, but also the consequences.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit. You'd referenced it a little bit earlier, said President Biden released a national resilience framework last fall, and just you're no longer in the federal government, and I'll see how I can get out of you. But what did you think of the framework?
So I think we made progress with starting to align a lot of different federal resources and programs in order to help states and communities and tribal nations achieve their goals. And that is a very complex undertaking to itself. And so I'd say between the climate resilience framework and having key principles and different sectors and issues identified, it was certainly helpful. There's more to be done, right? FEMA put out the National Resilience Guidance that was really focused on communities. It was intended not to be a federal wonky document and breaks down, again, like how different sectors of society can contribute to building resilience. Again, for practitioners in the space, it might feel like a primer, but it was about level setting so we can all have a common base to build from. And so even when it comes to community-driven relocation, I chaired the subcommittee for community-driven relocation with Brian Newland at Department of Interior. And again, the fragmentation of resources across the federal government, across state resources to help communities solve their problems is really mind-numbing. And so the progress made on even being able to say, where are you, Newtok, Alaska, in your process? Okay, these are the resources that can help with planning. These are the engineering. This is the soil erosion. Like all of that, I think we made some tremendous progress with, but it's certainly a launching pad. And even the investments from IRA and Bill, I think I saw them as a launching pad because the needs far outstrip the resources that I think that Congress has given and that are available through the federal government.
Yeah, I've talked a little bit about it. I think very useful and try to, like you said, integrate some of these different silos. But it was, to me, totally just for the insiders in the whole resilience and adaptation discussion. They weren't talking to the public with this. When you call something the National Resilience Framework, you're just making it impenetrable. And I think that was a missed opportunity. And you've done international work, a lot of it. And as you are well aware, pretty much all countries, I think 2 or 3, have a national adaptation plan. And so this was an attempt at it, even though it wasn't the official thing. Even that is a bit stronger. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I went through the framework and there's basically nothing when it comes to a communication strategy, or communication being a big part of it, which I think is one of the lowest hanging fruits that we can do on the resilience side. And there was nothing in it. So I quite honestly, I thought it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think having worked at different levels of government and internationally, I think particularly in the United States, there's this balance that culturally our country takes where the federal level generally tries not to be like dictating to others what to do. And we see it happen in so many different systems, right? Whether it's in a framework that's first and primarily intended to help the federal government organize itself and then those who want to partner with it, or it's even something as specific as building codes. Like other countries have national building codes. Here it's up to the states. And so your level of safety in your home changes state by state. And so there's just this deference that is helpful on one hand because we're as a nation that's very committed to community driven, hyper localized approaches to things. But on the other hand, I think probably your sense of dissatisfaction with that document may come from that desire to be not dictatorial.
Again, and the notion, even communication, I think we're going to be doing adaptation for years and still figuring it out. It's going to be a lot of trial and error, but the communication side, that's easier to do. And the fact that it's not emphasized, it's not just the federal government, it's just a lot of nonprofits. It's just, it's still so wonkish and insiderish on the climate adaptation side. So.
Even on the practical side, right? So like one of the things that was in my portfolio was risk communications at FEMA. And we every year would do this individual and household survey of how ready people are. And to your point, we haven't cracked the nut on how to do risk communication well, because even when we oversampled in areas that had just had wildfires to see if people were more prepared, they weren't, right? And so even the experience of a recent disaster didn't lead most Americans to get more prepared for a future event. And so it's certainly an issue of like behavioral science, behavioral economics, all of these other things, but we still have a long way to go when it goes to improving the way we do risk communication so that we see the commensurate action that we would hope to from our populace.
I just have a couple more questions about your time at FEMA, then we're going to pivot a bit here. But I like to think I know more about FEMA than your average citizen, but FEMA is still a mystery to me. And it gets such awful press, independent of this new administration. And there's a disaster hits, and then obviously there's some positive news, but then it also just gets lambasted. And I never quite understood it. I'm like, wow, FEMA's out there helping. And that they're really making the response is if they weren't there, this would be a disaster. Why does it get such awful press? Do you have any insight there?
Sure. I think that whenever we are in our kind of darkest moment or we've been impacted personally or our community's been impacted, we want the help immediately. We want things to be a certain way. And I think that FEMA has really improved since in the last decades on how it shows up more quickly, deploys more resources, make sure it's like covering many communities. I think COVID-19 and FEMA support for mass vaccination centers really helped FEMA understand how to deliver its work through an equity lens, which people continue today. But I think part of it is that the systems, we've underinvested at the state and federal and local level in emergency management in this nation, right? So imagine the calls coming in to FEMA for Helene and Milton, hundreds and thousands of calls a day. Yet the call center approach isn't that scalable, or the information management systems still haven't been modernized. If you looked at FEMA's request for money for budget to the department, you would see a huge deficit in the investment in the emergency management apparatus. Similarly, even though people at all levels are dealing with more frequent and severe events, important programs like the Emergency Management Planning Grant, EMPG, that funds a lot of staff has been flatlined. So you just see an underinvestment in emergency management that no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you're trying, how fast you move, with a chronic underinvestment, what people expect and want and what is able to deliver will always have a gap.
That explained a lot. My final question for you is your time at FEMA. What was the moment you were most proud of?
Oh, there's so many. I think that when I think back on my time at FEMA, there's like different things that I'm proud of. There's the work that our teams were able to do to really expand across the board in all our program areas, the ability of our programs to help underserved and disadvantaged communities in high-risk areas better. And so whether that was BRIC or as our training programs or our grant programs, like it was just across the board to see people given that opportunity to use the programs to drive more impact. And then I also had the opportunity to be an enabler of things that are really positive. Like I worked really hard with folks at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and Department of Homeland Security to change the benefit cost analysis this is super wonky. The benefit cost analysis discount rate was really high and people had wanted it changed forever. And so we were able to like work with the head of economists to switch it down to 3%. And I was able to understand that we as an agency really determined how much support we gave folks with doing those benefit cost analysis. So as the head of resilience, I'm like, great, if it's an underserved, disadvantaged community and you're saying that we can just support them and this is the barrier to accessing our programs, let's just offer that support as part of the grant application process so it's no longer a barrier. So it was really gratifying to be able to identify where there was a policy issue that we had, in essence, self-inflicted on ourselves that had these ramifications. And from a policy perspective, be able to remove a barrier. That was always very gratifying when we were able to find that, or even the flood risk management standard. It was something that the Obama administration really worked on. And we were able to push through the regulation in the Biden administration. And so it wasn't something I started, but because of my role, because I could be a champion, because I could be a collaborator, we were able to get things that had been long sought regulations to de-risk FEMA's federal investments through. So those were the kind of the types of things that were particularly gratifying, that even if there's some, I think, backslides now, I think that the core of what we were able to accomplish will have a long tail.
That was a very wonky answer, but that will be the honey to the ears of my typical listener. They love that kind of stuff, so that's good. We're going to do a major pivot here. And so we're a few months into this new administration, and we're seeing many programs dismantled, not just at FEMA, but elsewhere. Staff being silenced and climate change being scrubbed from FEMA's websites and the language. I did some searches, and you constantly find page not found on FEMA related to climate change. It's pretty horrifying. But I just want to before we dig into that, just personally, how has this been for you? You were in the thick of it and in an area that's really being attacked. How are you processing that before we get into specifics?
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's having been so focused on being an enabler and a catalyst for both community and national resilience. There's certainly an element of grief because we made so much progress with creating public goods like risk information that can help people understand what the consequences of climate change are that are gone. And similarly programs put on hold. And also communities that have spent so much time working on federal grants. Like none of those things are easy. Suddenly having the rug pulled out from under them. And so there's certainly a sense of like grief that I experience around both the loss of that potential better world that we're all working towards, where people are safer, able to recover faster, and also just the level of effort that so many communities have put into investing in themselves that's being impacted.
We can't go through everything, but can you maybe highlight some of the programs, a couple of them that are being dismantled or being cut away, just so we have a sense of what's being lost?
Sure. So I'll just speak to my portfolio at FEMA. So we would train thousands of people a year, emergency managers, first receivers, people working in climate adaptation. The schools have essentially been shuttered, right? No new courses being offered. Our big grant programs like the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program and Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, this last year's notice of funding rescinded, and for BRIC, anything that was selected but hadn't started, money being taken away. All the future conditions work, again, that's probably a page not found. The federal flood risk management standard, the agency is not implementing, the order is not to implement the regulation that was approved. And so the number of kind of things that are being either put on ice or walked back is too many to mention. And I think what concerns me most about that is communities' needs don't change. Just because we went from December to January doesn't mean the outlook for the future is any different, but things that are public goods, particularly those public goods that include information, like we're seeing it with NOAA and the fear of the privatization of the weather, where I think we're seeing it now with risk information, where you see a lot of companies doing really great work when it comes to risk modeling, but should risk modeling and really good information about the future be something that only those wealthy enough to afford it have access to. I think those are some of the things that are really at stake here that I grieve, because there's so many communities who are ready and want to do what's best, not just for today, but for the future.
It's interesting what the media covers because so much is happening, but I was actually surprised the BRIC program that you'd mentioned, it actually got a lot of coverage as being cut. Obviously, it's an important program, but again, it's one of these government programs most people don't know about. Were you surprised that it got so much coverage in the media that it's going to be taken away?
I think it's a program that fit a really important niche because it was a larger dollar resilience grant up to 50 million. And there's just not a lot of those at FEMA and across the federal government for this type of need. And so in some ways, I actually thought we would start to see more noise about some of the cuts at FEMA earlier. So I wasn't necessarily surprised about BRIC. I think I was more surprised that we didn't hear about that the media wasn't picking up some of the other cuts and changes even earlier on.
Here's another crystal ball question. What will happen with long-term recovery? And it appears like this president administrator wants FEMA to focus pretty narrowly on response, but have you heard anything about the federal recovery?
So long-term recovery has been one of those things that has been hotly debated and many permutations discussed for a very long time. In fact, when I was at FEMA the first time, post-Katrina, I helped create the National Disaster Recovery Framework and the recovery support functions that coordinate everybody. And even at that time, we said and had a whole report to OMB about the true cost of doing it well. And nobody has really wanted to invest in the true cost of doing it well. And so we've had this because it requires different programs to work together. It requires ensuring local governments and state governments have the capacity. And so I think in this case, again, it's that look. In the last administration, Biden administration did the same thing. They were looking at long-term recovery. So it's unclear how it's all going to shake out. I think we can clearly agree that we haven't achieved what we want to as a nation when it comes to productively supporting long-term recovery in the simplest, most effective way possible. And it'll be something we continue to really hash through, particularly given the fact we just have more complex recoveries happening each year.
Again, speculating, and storms are going to hit, disasters are going to hit, like you said, no matter what happens policy-wise, those things are going to happen. And I think about these areas that do get hit, red and blue areas, Republican and Democratic areas, and a lot of times it's more rural that really get slammed. And I think about the politicians in these areas, they want help for their people, right? They're going to, when storm hits or something, they're going to want it. But then if FEMA is gutted, or even if it's not gutted, even if there's not a huge loss of personnel, which it sounds like that still could be, when you lack a strategic initiative, that you're not really focused and you don't have your shit together, it's hard to respond to these things. How do you speculate, let's say, this summer's storm season might unfold?
I think in essence, the cuts at FEMA, whether it's been people who've been let go or just the environment, which has become really hard for many dedicated public servants, which has led to more people choosing that early resignation option, essentially leaves the agency in a position where a lot of its people with the most institutional knowledge, its most seasoned leaders, have left. So what that could essentially do this summer is like a self-reinforcing narrative that the administration has been really teeing up, that FEMA is not as effective as it needs to be. But part of the reason for that will be because of the brain drain and the early silver tsunami that occurs because people feel compelled to leave given the environment. And so what that will likely do is lead to a much rougher hurricane season. I think those in the field are starting to feel very concerned about the ability of the federal level to support the state level to support the locals. And so this year will probably be messy. If in the out years, as some emergency management folks would like, there's massive block grants to states to do this themselves, then over the next several years, a lot of those red states in particular that you mentioned are also very fiscally conservative and don't allow for departments to hire people. Doing disaster management requires people. And so we'll probably see contracts with some of the companies that provide that support. So I am also seeing, just like NOAA is concerned about the privatization of the weather, we could very much be in an environment where state by state there's a privatized disaster response capability, given that neither the federal nor state government can hire the people to do the work.
Yeah, it's just this false sense of they're trying to save money over the long term. And when you privatize these things, they tend to be just so much more expensive. They lock in much higher rates and such. Oh, that sounds horrible. All right. There's this conversation happening like FEMA even being dismantled. And I don't feel like I've heard much of it lately, but what's your take on that? That seems it's one thing cutting budgets, but actually dismantling FEMA?
I'm hopeful that this executive council that was established through executive order will be enabled to do its job of doing a review of the agency. I don't know if it'll be given the chance to do what it was asked to do. We haven't seen yet as we were talking today, we haven't seen who's been announced to be part of it. We haven't seen that it stood up. And so I do think there's a high likelihood that we see, like you said, FEMA really brought back to its civil defense early day mission scope. And we've learned so much since then, right? We learned that just responding never gets us out of this loop of disaster and human suffering. And so the way FEMA has evolved since 1979 has been to really, in many ways, not just put the Band-Aids on the problems, but be a federal agency that leads the coordination for the resilience building, the recovery as well. And so I think those pieces are in my space in resilience. I think a lot of staff are very fearful that the programs are going to be dismantled one by one and that or may never be taken off ice. So there is a very big chance, I think, that without communities who are benefiting and valuing some of this support, sharing those stories, to your point about communication, I think it's not looking good in terms of the ability of FEMA to continue to do a lot of its great work around risk reduction and resilience.
So I look at this new administration and they've come in fearlessly doing what they want to do. And obviously most of it's bad. And I think of Democratic administrations, President Biden, they're doing things by the book, relatively cautious, very thoughtful. And I think that's good. But sometimes that cautiousness may lead us into some trouble. And so you have every adaptation policy. You think about FEMA, and no matter how effective it is on the ground, let's just say it can't survive the next administration, meaning a different party and such. Are we just designing these programs to fail politically? If you could have a great program that's good on the ground, but if you're not designing these policies to withstand the next administration, are they really good policies at all?
My kind of reflection on this has been that, firstly, I had believed, and I think we're finding out wrongly, that disaster management and helping people, basically reducing human suffering caused by disasters, I thought that was apolitical, right? That it would transcend political spectrums. And because there's dismantling so many of the programs that are aimed at reducing disaster risk, unfortunately, as you've seen, FEMA's become hyper politicized. And I think for future administrations, one of my takeaways has been that the work around adaptation and resilience really needs to continue to be nurtured at that state and local level, because it's in the state legislatures, it's at the local government level, at the county government level, in tribal nations, where the desire, the policies that enable that local action take place. And then the federal government as a support is providing additional resources or aid. But there's still, so long as that at the state by state level, there's not a more robust approach, how things change at the federal level will continue probably to swing until we're a nation where state by state, that realization and commitment to reducing risk and keeping people safe is stronger.
Yeah, that's a good point. We all thought we're helping people that are impacted by disaster, both Republican and Democrat, and just the assumption that we'd want to keep doing that in a robust way. We can't assume anything with this administration and other areas. For you, you're no longer there, and you say a lot of people are leaving, but there's still a lot of people that are staying at FEMA. Do you have any messages that you want to share with former colleagues at FEMA?
I think for my former colleagues, I just have deep gratitude because FEMA is filled with so many incredible people who are mission driven. It's an agency that lived by core values of compassion and integrity and things that I think most of us want to see more of in this nation. And I think my message for anyone being impacted by what's happening right now or losing their roles is that there's so many ways to be of service. And so that passion of contributing to adaptation, risk reduction, resilience, like that passion can find new ways to drive impact. It may not be at the federal level, but there's so many other places and ways to really help communities achieve their goals. And so in some ways, the exodus from one place of service to other places of service will plant new seeds and lead to new and hopefully better outcomes for people across the nation.
But what advice would you give the next person that was in your old role? And I guess I obviously mean a Democratic administration. But if you could sit down with them at the very beginning, what would you say?
Yeah. So to your point about how a Democratic administration is so focused on collaboration and stakeholder engagement and input, it took a very long time to do certain things. And so I think there's some areas where it's okay to move faster. And because we've got science and evidence on the side, and so really leveraging conversations of the past and just ramping up even faster when it comes to a next opportunity to move our country forward.
Excellent. Okay, final question. I ask this of all my guests. If you could recommend one person to come on this podcast, obviously a climate adaptation podcast.
That's a great question. Let's see. I would, and maybe they've already been on your podcast, but I would recommend Amy Chester from Rebuild by Design. She already been on your podcast, probably.
Yes, she has. It's been a little while, but it wasn't actually a longer conversation. It was part of kind of just highlighting one of the tools that they created.
I think one reason she'd be interesting is because they've been doing this Atlas of Disasters work, really looking at impacts and kind of the cost of disasters. And I think that mentality and that ethos that they bring is so key right now, because to the point about adaptation, one of the kind of stark experiences I had when I served as deputy administrators was visiting Quigleok, Alaska, where like their best case scenario, where this is a community impacted by the permafrost degrading and storms and everything. All they wanted was to move their like HUD manufactured housing inland, and they couldn't even get the funding for that. Yet it's a community that still does like hunting in their traditional areas. Like stick-built housing and definitely manufactured housing is not actually the best design solution for this community, but it's what we're offering. And so I do think there's an opportunity particularly for adaptation and the work that Amy does to really bring those design principles to community conversations and envision a future people actually want, not just what they're able to grasp at.
No, that's good. And it's been a while, and I have listeners that haven't probably heard her, so it's good to remind people. We did talk about the Atlas, and yeah, really interesting tool. So good suggestion. All right, Victoria, I'm going to let you go. First off, I just want to thank you for your service. We're doing amazing work at FEMA and appreciate all that you're doing. And I have a feeling there's going to be a future role for you to help clean up this mess in a future administration, maybe. But thanks again for coming on.
Doug, thanks so much for having me on today. It was a true pleasure.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Victoria Salinas for joining me on the podcast. Victoria gave us a rare inside look at how the federal government was, at one point, seriously investing in climate adaptation. That work wasn't perfect, but it was real, and now much of it is being undone. We're watching in real time as FEMA and other agencies like it are stripped of the leadership, vision, and programs that made communities safer and more prepared. The systems we thought we could rely on are proving to be fragile, politically, structurally, and even morally. So what does that mean for adaptation? It means the work just got harder. And more important, because we can't depend on the federal government to lead, others will have to step up. States, cities, NGOs, even individual communities. Big thanks to Victoria for her candor and continued commitment to resilience, especially when it's no longer politically convenient to talk about. This isn't just a story about FEMA. It's a warning and a call to adapt anyway. Victoria mentioned the executive council that was going to be created. Well, since our recording, that council has been appointed. If you want to know who's on it, I have a link in the show notes. The dismantling of FEMA is an ongoing saga, and we'll revisit this issue, I'm sure, in the months and years ahead. Thanks again to Victoria for her public service, and let's hope we see her back in government when politicians who take our public safety seriously are back in charge. Before I let you go, let's talk about putting your climate adaptation work where it belongs, front and center in the national conversation. Imagine your organization's climate adaptation work featured on one of the only national platforms still talking about adaptation. Yes, that's America Adapts. While federal agencies go silent on climate, this podcast remains a trusted space to spotlight innovation, influence decision makers, and keep the conversation alive for years to come. We'll work together to spotlight your achievements, elevate the voices that matter, and craft a narrative that resonates with funders, policymakers, and your stakeholders. And you'll be doing more than raising your profile. You'll be helping build the larger public understanding of climate resilience at a time that understanding is desperately needed. Forget webinars that vanish or reports that go unread. A podcast episode lives on, reaching listeners for months and years after it's released. NRDC, World Wildlife Fund, UCLA, Harvard, the Department of Defense at one point have all used America Adapts to amplify their adaptation work. Now it's your turn. Adaptation isn't going away. Climate change isn't going away, but the conversation is being silenced at the highest levels. Let's keep it alive. Reach out at americaadapts@gmail.com and let's talk. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.